No Nut November has come, or not as the case may be, and gone. Still with us, however, is some of the rather unusual criticism of the whole event. The arguments against it seem to come in three main flavours. The first is that pornography addiction just isn't a thing, it doesn't actually exist. The second one is something about prostate cancer. And the third one is that this is all fascist white supremacist bigotry. Yes, that third one is serious and actually happened. Not only from absolute wingnuts on Twitter, but from semi-mainstream media outlets. Obviously in this video I'm not going to be addressing the third one of those arguments because it is insane, and anyone who makes that argument in any degree of earnest should probably contact a mental health professional. The other two arguments, that pornography addiction is not a thing and the something about prostate cancer, these are actually somewhat interesting to talk about. And I'm going to be tackling them in that order because pornography addiction, or the concept of pornography addiction, is actually quite a large and complex topic, despite what several heavily biased and self-interested commentators might say. So to start us off, what exactly is No Nut November? Well, it starts with the colloquialism bust a nut in reference to ejaculation or orgasm, and the concept of not doing it for the month of November, possibly because November is a month of men's issues awareness, sometimes termed Movember. That time when men grow moustaches or beards to show some sort of societal interest in the topic. This is in some cases related to prostate cancer, so you can kind of see where the tie-in came. November, Movember, prostate cancer awareness, masturbation, ejaculation, it all ties together somewhat nicely. Rules for No Nut November vary from person to person. Some believe that it is a month to abstain completely from orgasm, some would say that you only abstain from masturbation, and some would say that it is only abstinence from viewing pornography and masturbation. Of course, some people, if they don't masturbate, may simply put it down to abstinence from pornography, and any and all combinations thereof besides. There are a few thoughts that spring to mind on this topic before we get into the nitty-gritty of pornography addiction and prostate health. And this is to do with how people define what exactly No Nut November is, or what their goal is for that month. By far the strictest sense is abstinence from PMO, that is pornography, masturbation, orgasm. All of them. By far the strictest regime, and one which I could see causing problems if you're engaging in this when you have sexual partners. Of course, in that instance, communication is going to be key. Tell your partner, this is something which I want to engage in for this month. It's something to do with self-improvement, learning self-discipline, general control and restraint for yourself, and hopefully it is something that they will support you in. Hell, they may even join you on the journey, and then you have to withhold your affections from each other for 1 month, and then on the 1st of December, put on the Barry White double CD special, kick everyone else out of all of the surrounding buildings because of the noise complaints, and absolutely go to town on each other. So that could be fun. Abstinence from pornography and masturbation only, this would be something heavily leaning towards self-improvement in general. I see no particular problem with this and will go into why shortly. And people who view it as only abstinence from masturbation or only abstinence from pornography if they already don't masturbate, well, again, same thing. General self-improvement, which I see no particular problems with. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get into topic the first, which is pornography addiction and why so many people are looking to try to remove pornography from their lives. The first and most obvious question to ask at this point is pornography addiction actually even a thing? Well, going by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, otherwise known as the DSM-5, which is related to America only, and the International Classification of Diseases, ICD, which is an international diagnostic tool, no, pornography addiction is not a thing according to either of these manuals. Well, surely that means case closed. Authority says no, therefore the answer is no. However, that is not the case. This answer of no is in fact highly divisive. One of the main reasons for this is that the phenomenon of highly accessible widespread pornography is relatively new, only coming up within the last 20 years. This means that in terms of the entire history of diagnostic medicine, this is relatively new. And of course, nationally and internationally recognized medical guidelines, they take years, perhaps even decades to institute. So the lack of official guidelines or official diagnostic criteria for pornography addiction is not proof in itself that pornography addiction as a phenomenon doesn't exist. After all, to use another example, gravity wasn't invented by Sir Isaac Newton. It wasn't that he wrote down a formula one day and then suddenly everything came crashing down to the ground. The phenomenon itself has existed since the beginning of time, and that phenomenon is also going to exist regardless of human codification. Just because someone hasn't qualified it yet, just because someone hasn't written down exactly what it is, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And this is very important because this brings us on to what exactly is pornography something? Is it pornography addiction? Is it pornography compulsion? Is it some sort of mental dysfunction? Is it a sexual dysfunction? These are all the questions which are currently being asked around this topic. So first and foremost, we need to really look at what exactly is an addiction, and can we say that pornography falls into that pattern? For example, this paper from 2011 from Grant et al. Entitled Introduction to Behavioral Addictions mentions this quite specifically in its introduction. Several behavioral addictions have been hypothesized as having similarities to substance addictions. The current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 4th edition, has designated formal diagnostic criteria for several of these disorders, e.g. pathological gambling and kleptomania, classifying them as impulse control disorders, a separate category from substance use disorders. Other behaviors, or impulse control disorders, have been considered for inclusion in the forthcoming DSM. Compulsive buying, pathological skin picking, sexual addiction, excessive tanning, computer or video game playing, and internet addiction. Which behaviors to include as behavioral addictions is still open for debate. Not all impulse control disorders or disorders characterized by impulsivity should be considered behavioral addictions. Although many of the impulse control disorders, e.g. pathological gambling and kleptomania, appear to share core features with substance addictions, others, such as intermittent explosive disorder, may not. In the hope of contributing to this debate, this paper reviews the evidence for similarities between behavioral addictions and substance use disorders, their distinction from obsessive-compulsive disorder, and identifies areas of uncertainty warranting future research. It also serves as an introduction to the succeeding papers in this issue, which review some putative addiction behaviors in more detail. And that's just a very brief, quick overview of what exactly is addiction and how are we classifying them. Later in the paper they go into more detail, mentioning that essential features of behavioral addictions is a failure to resist an impulse, drive, or temptation to perform an act that is harmful to the person or to others. They mention the preceding feelings of tension or arousal before committing an act, and the pleasure, gratification, or relief at the time of committing the act. This paper also notes how a lot of the sensations and feelings that people get around non-physical addictions is very similar to people who have a physical addiction to something like a drug. This paper then goes on to cite several studies which links certain addictive or compulsive behaviors to specific brain activity, often involving the serotonin or dopamine systems. Basically, doing the thing that you're addicted to gives you a massive dopamine hit, and that makes you feel pretty good, for a short time anyway. Of course, that dopamine hit wears off, and then you feel the urge to do it again later. The key point surrounding addiction or compulsive behavior is the lack of ability to moderate your behavior in regards to getting that dopamine fix. This paper then goes into some quite great detail regarding the diagnostic issues of addiction or compulsive behaviors. usually focusing on preoccupation with behavior, diminished ability to control your behavior, tolerance, withdrawal, and adverse psychosocial consequences. Basically, if people can't stay away from something and they start getting a bit antsy because they can't have that thing, that's probably a sign that they have something deeper going on under the hood rather than simply occasionally enjoying that particular thing. And this paper asks some very important questions, such as this paragraph. One diagnostic question raised in the literature is, where do behavioral addictions fall on an impulsivity-compulsivity dimension? Are they more like impulse control disorders or obsessive-compulsive disorders? Some have argued that this unitary dimension approach is overly simplistic, and that impulsivity and compulsivity represent orthogonal dimensions, rather than opposite poles of a single dimension. Consistent with the latter argument are findings such as substantial variation in degree of impulsivity among people with behavioral addictions, variation that may be associated with response to pharmacological treatment. In the DSM-4, substance addictions, substance use disorders, are an independent category, while pathological gambling is considered an impulse control disorder similar to, for example, pyromania and kleptomania. ICD-10 classifies pathological gambling as a habit and impulse disorder, but recognizes that the behavior is not compulsive in the technical sense, even though it is sometimes called compulsive gambling. All of these interesting key points and all of the data in between brings us to the summary and conclusion, which I will just read straight through verbatim. Growing evidence indicates that behavioral addictions resemble substance addictions in many domains, including natural history, chronic, relapsed course with higher incidence and prevalence in adolescents and young adults, phenomenology, subjective craving, intoxication, high and withdrawal, tolerance, comorbidity, overlapping genetic contribution, neurobiological mechanisms, with roles for brain glutamatergic, opioidergic, serotonergic, and dopamine mesolimbic systems, and response to treatment. However, existing data are most extensively for pathological gambling, with only limited data for compulsive buying, internet addiction, and video or computer game addiction, and almost no data for other behavioral addictions such as sexual addiction, love addiction, pathological skin picking, or excessive tanning. There is sufficient evidence to warrant considering pathological gambling as a non-substance or behavioral addiction. The DSM-5 task force has proposed moving its classification in DSM-5 from an impulse control disorder to an addiction and related disorders. In the current state of knowledge, especially in the absence of validated diagnostic criteria and prospective longitudinal studies, it is still premature to consider other behavioral addictions as full-fledged independent disorders, much less classify them all as similar to substance addictions rather than as impulse control disorders. Substantial future research, including both human and animal studies, is needed to bring our knowledge of behavioral addictions to the level of that for substance addictions, especially in the domains of genetics, neurobiology, and treatment. So whether you want to term it as addiction or some sort of compulsive behavior, these things are not easy to define. And it's certainly not as simple as simply declaring that something is or is not an addiction. The book Practical Guide to Paraphilia and Paraphilic Disorders has within its pages references to the revision process of the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5. Chapter 14 is the most relevant. It deals with non-paraphilic hypersexual disorders. Hypersexual disorder being the closest thing to addiction or compulsion regarding sex that the DSM-5 mentions. Once again, the introduction hits very much the same beats regarding this use of terminology and how complex it is. One major theoretical debate in sex research is the conceptualization of high-frequent, non-paraphilic sexual behavior. As a consequence, different attempts have been made to categorize excessive sexual behavior by using different existing psychopathological categories. Khan's introduced the phrase sexual addiction as a mood-altering pathological phenomenon connected to a sexual process or sexual event. Coleman proposed the term sexual compulsivity, characterized as temporary regulation of anxiety and distress provoked by intrusion of sexually obsessive behaviors. The expression sexual impulsivity was preferred by Barth and Kinder to designate the inability to control strong sexual wishes or reduce the preoccupation with sexual activity. Kafka finally introduced the concept of paraphilia-related disorder, defined as the increased expression of not socially deviant sexual fantasies, urges, and behaviors. Bancroft and Vukadinovich criticized the conceptualization of excessive sexual behavior by using well-known psychopathological categories. The authors argued that different etiological mechanisms for the same kind of excessive sexual behavior might exist. As a consequence, the descriptive expression out-of-control sexual behavior was preferred by these authors until the different etiological mechanisms were clarified. However, Frank et al. Argued that the phrase out of control still suggests a control problem and, for this reason, is not descriptive in nature. As part of the revision process of the 5th edition of the DSM-5, Kafka suggested an operational criterion-based definition for the so-called hypersexual disorder. In addition, the attempt was made to avoid linking diagnosis to existing psychopathological frameworks. Although Kafka's proposal was not included in the DSM-5, it seems highly relevant in clinical contexts, since hypersexual disorder might be a risk factor for sexual violence, and persons affected report serious impairment in social functioning. The proposed diagnostic criteria for hypersexual disorder is the most telling table of all mentioned in this part, and is listed across 3 sections, the first with multiple subsections. A. Over a period of at least 6 months, recurrent and intense sexual fantasies, sexual urges, or sexual behaviors in association with 3 or more of the following 5 criteria. 1. Time consumed by sexual fantasies, urges, or behaviors repetitively interfere with other important non-sexual goals, activities, and obligations. 2. Repetitively engaging in sexual fantasies, urges, or behaviors in response to dysphoric mood states, e.g. anxiety, depression, boredom, or irritability. 3. Repetitively engaging in sexual fantasies, urges, or behaviors in response to stressful life events. 4. Repetitive but unsuccessful efforts to control or significantly reduce these sexual fantasies, urges, or behaviors. 5. Repetitively engaging in sexual behaviors while disregarding the risk for physical or emotional harm to self or others. B. There is clinically significant personal distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning associated with the frequency and intensity of these sexual fantasies, urges, or behaviors. C. These sexual fantasies, urges, or behaviors are not due to the direct physiological effect of an exogenous substance, e.g. a drug of abuse or a medication. Specify further if masturbation, pornography, sexual behavior with consenting adults, cybersex, telephone sex, strip clubs, or other. You'll notice we're hitting a lot of the same beats when it comes to, basically, does this behavior cause you a problem? Is it intruding into your life? And are you struggling to manage that behavior? Because all of these factors are part of the diagnosis of something being an addiction. Now, as to the prevalence of self-admitted problematic use of pornography, there is a source which I've been able to dig up. However, it does rely on self-reporting. This was done in 2002 and was conducted for PBS Frontline by the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender and Reproduction. This is hosted on apa.org. And while this survey found that 86% of respondents said porn can educate people, 72% said it provides a harmless outlet for fantasies, and 80% said they felt fine about their use of pornography, 9% of porn viewers said they had tried unsuccessfully to stop. Now, I want to highlight once again that this was self-reported. So it's very possible that the number of people admitting to having tried to stop and failing could be higher because obviously there is an impulse because of shame to hide that fact. There's also the possibility that the numbers of people saying that they are fine with their pornography consumption might not actually be fine with their pornography consumption. They may not simply be willing to admit that they have a problem. But this is the data that we have to work with. Jumping back over to chapter 14 of the previous text, mentions some of these problems when it comes to diagnostic criteria for hypersexuality disorders. That these are things that people feel uncomfortable talking about, and so they are less likely to be honest with doctors when confronting the problem. So if 9% of people who use pornography are self-admittedly unable to stop viewing it, even if that viewing isn't intruding into other aspects of their life, I would suggest that that certainly qualifies as something. Whether we want to term that as an addiction, a compulsion, a hypersexual disorder, or something else entirely, it is something. If someone has a behavior that they do not want to engage in and they are unable to prevent themselves from engaging in that behavior, that is a problem. And it's even more of a problem if that person is experiencing a degree of psychological distress as a result of being unable to modulate their behavior. Quickly going back to this same problem in the context of hypersexual disorders, in the evidence section they specifically note that they've been able to identify prevalence rates of 3 to 6% for people who fit the diagnostic criteria for hypersexual disorders. Putting these two bits of data together, it seems that if you just float the suggestion out there, the question, do you find yourself viewing pornography and masturbating and are unable to prevent yourself from doing so, there are going to be people who answer yes. And once again, I would suggest that this points to something. Whether or not you agree with the usage of the term addiction, compulsion, disorder, whatever, the nomenclature is frankly irrelevant. What matters is that there seems to be a very distinct phenomenon that is there. Further evidence of this phenomenon comes from yet another self-reported survey, and yes, they all have to be self-reported because there is no official criteria for working out what this sexual dysfunction is, found that using a representative sample size of around 20,000 people, 4% of men and 1% of women self-reported being addicted to pornography. Out of those who said that they were addicted, about half also reported that using pornography had had a negative effect on them. While it's difficult to obtain the exact specifics regarding what a bad effect is, whether it is something that is objectively bad or simply subjectively bad, I would once again suggest that that is somewhat a secondary question to the fact that people are self-reporting this phenomenon. If people are able to admit that their use of pornography or their practice of masturbation is negatively impacting their life, say by taking time away from their families, say taking time away from their work, generally intruding where it should not be, this is a problem. So this is all well and good, but it might be suffering a little bit from being somewhat wishy-washy owing to self-reporting and a lack of concrete definitions. So why don't we just go ahead and go straight to the source, cut out the pesky imperfect middleman which is language, and see what's going on in people's brains. Well, one study attempted to do exactly that, and that would be this one. Sexual desire, not hypersexuality, is related to neurophysiological responses elicited by sexual images. This study took a relatively small sample size, 52 people, flashed up a bunch of mixed images in front of them, and measured the P300 wave going on in their brain. The P300 wave is an event-related potential or ERP component elicited in the process of decision-making. By far my favourite part of this study, and the fact that this is my favourite part of the study kind of highlights my overall opinion of it, was this part where they talk about the stimuli. 225 colour images were selected from 2 standardised sets of stimuli commonly used in psychological research to represent pleasant e.g. skydiving, neutral, e.g. portrait, and unpleasant, e.g. mutilated body categories. And in between flashing up all of those images, they would of course flash up the sexual stimuli pictures. And then later in the paper they note, in addition, participants were instructed not to stimulate themselves during testing. So you're sitting in a lab, strapped to a chair, and a doctor says to you, "We're going to flash a bunch of images in front of you and see what your brain does." Some of those images are going to be neutral, some of them are going to be pleasant, some of them are going to be sexual in nature, and some of them are going to be hardcore gore. Don't touch yourself. Well done, guys. Well done. While this study certainly is interesting in seeing what exactly was firing off in the brain when these images were selected, there are several problems with this study, most of which were highlighted in another paper, High Desire or Merely an Addiction, a response to Steele et al., published in the same journal a few months later, in which the critic notes several critical flaws within the previous study, the first and most obvious being the complete and utter lack of a control group. Hilton, who is the critic here, also notes that there are several definitional problems within the study, specifically definitions relating to desire and addiction, claiming that the definitions are based on a series of assumptions and qualifications, the limitations of which are acknowledged by the authors of the initial study, but are then inexplicably ignored in reaching the conclusions that the authors do. Hilton then goes on to note that the use of the P300 as the only measurement in this study is highly flawed, especially since the Steele paper was attempting to replicate the methodology of a paper done by Dunning et al. Previously. The problem being that the Dunning et al. Paper used several different ERP measurements in the brain, including early posterior negativity and late positive potential. The Dunning et al. Paper also distinguished between these different ERPs in people who were abstinent of drug use, currently engaged in drug use, and a healthy control group. All of these things were absent in the Steele et al. Paper, who focused exclusively on the P300. More amusingly is that the Steele et al. Authors even acknowledge this critical flaw in design, stating, "Another possibility is that the P300 is not the best place to identify relationships with sexually motivating stimuli. The slightly later LPP appears more strongly linked to motivation." End quote. Steele et al. Admit that they are in fact not able to compare their results to the Dunning et al. Study, yet their conclusions effectively make such a comparison. Hilton goes on to state, "Further, this significant finding is a negative correlation between P300 and desire for sex with a partner, indicating that P300 amplitude is related to lower sexual desire. This directly contradicts the interpretation of P300 as high desire. There are no comparisons to other addict groups. There are no comparisons to control groups. The conclusions drawn by the researchers are a quantum leap from the data, which say nothing about whether people who report trouble regulating their viewing of sexual images have or do not have brain responses similar to cocaine or other kinds of addicts." So while the Steele et al. P300 study seemed to indicate that addiction to pornography is not a thing, it is riddled with too many methodological flaws to draw an accurate conclusion. So what exactly is going on in the brain? If this P300 study isn't worth the paper that it's written on, are there any studies which are? Well, the answer is of course yes, studies such as this one. Pornography Addiction, a Neuroscience Perspective. This particular paper opens by referencing studies which have been done on cocaine, methamphetamine, and obesity, all of which show similar patterns of brain development. That is, the brain adapts to these stimuli in very similar ways. Basically, all of these stimuli, be they drugs or food, hijack the mesolimbic reward system, which you may remember is tied to dopamine and serotonin. This led to Dr. Howard Schaefer at Harvard writing, "I had great difficulty with my own colleagues when I suggested that a lot of addiction is the result of experience, repetitive, high-emotion, high-frequency experience. But it's become clear that neuroadaptation, that is, changes in neural circuitry that help perpetuate the behavior, occurs even in the absence of drug taking. More recently, he wrote, although it is possible to debate whether we should include substance or process addictions within the kingdom of addiction, technically, there is little choice. Just as the use of exogenous substances precipitate imposter molecules vying for receptor sites within the brain, human activities stimulate naturally occurring neurotransmitters. The activity of these naturally occurring psychoactive substances likely will be determined as important mediators of many process addictions. These findings have, of course, since been confirmed in numerous other studies which have been done in the field, several of which dealt with delta phos-B. This was first found in animals which had drug addictions, but it has since been found in relation to overconsumption of natural rewards, including eating and sex. And this is something which, while genetically influenced, adding yet more weight to the hypothesis of genetic links to addiction, is also something which the brain adapts to environmentally. Further research done several years later only helped to strengthen this case. Further published papers have helped to collate and solidify this position, such as this paper, Pornography Addiction, a Supranormal Stimulus Considered in the Context of Neuroplasticity. The findings of this literature review can best be summarized in the following paragraphs. Our brains naturally seek novelty, and sexuality can condition a powerful reward with novelty. Primitive organisms exhibit trophic behavior conducive to survival, and evidence exists of dopamine-related survival incentive and chordate ancestors. Dopamine-powered motivation projected in early amniotes from the primitive mesencephalon to the progressively complex telecephalon throughout the course of phylogeny. Obviously, human sexual drive and subsequent volitional motivation and reward procurement are much more complex than unicellular trophisms, but the more primitive mesolimbic dopaminergic salient centers shares these basic drives. Hypersexual syndrome, while descriptive behaviorally, falls short of the term sexual addiction in describing the current state of understanding of compulsive sexual behaviors. It ignores 2 decades of research about how learning changes the brain both micro and macroscopically, and it does a disservice to both professionals and the public in inconsistently exempting the most powerful natural dopaminergic reward in the nervous system, sexual orgasm, from neuroplastic learning. Pornography is a perfect laboratory for this kind of novel learning fused with a powerful pleasure incentive drive. The focused searching and clicking, looking for the perfect masturbatory subject, is an exercise in neuroplastic learning. Indeed, it is illustrative of Tinbergen's concept of the supranormal stimulus, with plastic surgery-enhanced breasts presented in limitless novelty in humans serving the same purpose as Tinbergen's and Magnus's artificially enhanced female butterfly models. The males of each species prefer the artificial to the naturally evolved. In this sense, the enhanced novelty provides, metaphorically speaking, a pheromone-like effect in human males, like moths, which is inhibiting orientation and disrupting pre-mating communication between the sexes by permeating the atmosphere. Consider, hypothetically, 2 individuals frantically fixated on their computers, both trying to win an intermittently reinforced reward. Both spend hours a night at their task and have for some period to the point of exhaustion. Work and personal relationships are affected negatively, yet they cannot stop. One is looking at pornography, searching for just the right clip for sexual consummation. The other is engrossed in an online poker game. One reward is masturbatory and the other monetary, yet the DSM-5 clarifies only the poker as an addiction. This is both behaviorally and biologically inconsistent. All of this is somewhat a long-winded scientific way of saying something very simple, and that is that pornography consumption changes your brain in the same way that substance addiction does. Even further meta-analyses, such as this one, Neuroscience of Internet Pornography Addiction, a Review and Update, yields somewhat unsurprising and predictable results. Reading from the abstract, many recognize that severe behaviors potentially affecting the reward circuitry in human brains lead to a loss of control and other symptoms of addiction in at least some individuals. Regarding internet addiction, neuroscientific research supports the assumption that underlying neural processes are similar to substance addiction. The American Psychiatric Association has recognized one such internet-related behavior, internet gaming, as a potential addictive disorder warranting further study, in the 2013 revision of their Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. Other internet-related behaviors, e.g. internet pornography use, were not covered. Within this review, we give a summary of the concepts proposed underlying addiction and give an overview about neuroscientific studies on internet addiction and internet gaming disorder. Moreover, we reviewed available neuroscientific literature on internet pornography addiction and connect the results to the addiction model. This review leads to the conclusion that internet pornography addiction fits into the addiction framework and shares similar basic mechanisms with substance addiction. Together with studies on internet addiction and internet gaming disorder, we see strong evidence for considering addictive internet behaviors as behavioral addiction. Future research needs to address whether or not there are specific differences between substance and behavioral addiction. After looking at all of this data, if you are a person who falls into the camp of believing that pornography addiction is not a thing, sorry to tell you this, but the science disagrees. With that said, however, there is no qualifier as to the prevalence of pornography addiction, merely the proof that pornography addiction is possible. Looking at the various studies and surveys regarding people claiming they are addicted to pornography and people claiming they have attempted to stop using pornography but found themselves unable to do so, we can probably say that pornography addiction is not a majority position. However, as always, further research must be done. Now, as to making a commentary on the people saying that they are not going to engage in No Nut November, people saying that it's a stupid thing to do, people making the frankly stupid case that you have some sort of duty to continue consuming pornography in November, so as to spite a bunch of people engaging in self-improvement. To those people, I would suggest that if you find yourself in a position where you are unable to abstain from the use of pornography or masturbation for a month, you may be in the throes of addiction. Pornography is not necessary for your continued survival. You can, objectively, go for 30 days without it and still live. If you are unable to do so, that says everything that we need to know.
Hi, are you participating in No Nut November? Stop it! What the fuck is wrong with you? Do you want prostate cancer? Because that's how you get prostate cancer. Beat your meat!
Yes, 38 minutes into the video, and we are finally getting around to part 2, otherwise known as Something About Prostate Cancer. This part is less complex and a little bit less controversial, but does require proponents of this argument to fundamentally fail at understanding biology. The first question to be asked is, does masturbation actually reduce your risk of getting prostate cancer? To which the answer is no. It is not masturbation that does this, but ejaculation. The term masturbation and ejaculation are not synonyms, and this is an important distinction to make. It's also important to note that ejaculation can happen in absence of masturbation and in absence of pornography. To understand this best, I think it's important to look at this from the standpoint of a very longitudinal study. So first of all, we have this one from 2004, Ejaculation Frequency and Subsequent Risk of Prostate Cancer. This was then followed up with Ejaculation Frequency and Risk of Prostate Cancer, updated results with an additional decade of follow-up, which was published in 2016. Methodology for these studies is quite simple. You ask people how frequently they ejaculate, and you just kind of hope that they don't lie about it. The results are pretty consistent in finding that ejaculation frequency doesn't really have a huge impact on prostate health. That is, until you get to a very high frequency, that is about 21 ejaculations per month or more. And this decreased risk persisted even when taking into other confounding variables such as lifestyle choice, which would include things such as diet and exercise. All of this taken together produced about a 33% lower lifetime risk of prostate cancer. Now, on face value, that sounds absolutely amazing, doesn't it? 33% less likelihood of getting prostate cancer. But you have to consider what exactly is the lifetime likelihood of getting prostate cancer to start with. Well, prostatecancer.org suggests that about 1 in 9 men will get prostate cancer, giving you a risk of developing it a shade over 11%. So when we're looking at this high ejaculation frequency, we are reducing that 11% chance by about 30%. In other words, taking it from about 11% to about 8%. Which, all things considered, isn't really a huge gain, especially if this higher ejaculation frequency comes about as a result of pornography and masturbation. Certainly, I would suggest not worth developing an addiction for. As for people holding the belief that your testicles are going to become damaged as a result of not ejaculating frequently enough, well, rather unsurprisingly, your testicles didn't evolve to need pornography and frequent masturbation. Your testicles have the ability to reabsorb certain parts of the seminal fluid, and anything which can't be reabsorbed can be ejaculated out in your sleep in the form of nocturnal emissions. No work required, your body just does it for you. So there we have it, No Nut November in a nutshell. Pornography addiction, from a biological standpoint, is absolutely a thing. And it seems somewhat an inevitability that pornography addiction will eventually become recognized as the problem that it is. In the meantime, there is just going to be active debate about the exact terminology that should be used to describe the phenomenon that absolutely does exist. As for the testicular and prostate side of things, they can take care of themselves. They don't require any active engagement from you. While frequent ejaculation may reduce your risk of getting prostate cancer, your risk of getting prostate cancer is already pretty damn low. Encouraging people to develop a pornography and masturbation addiction to help reduce their risk of prostate cancer is, I think, a ridiculous position to hold, because you're ultimately encouraging people to get a more damaging condition to deal with something which they might not ever develop anyway. As for No Nut November itself, I view it as just an exercise in self-improvement. Your body does not require pornography or masturbation to continue existing in a healthy state, and if removing pornography consumption and masturbation from your life improves other aspects of your life, that is only a good thing. If you find that you are unable to abstain from pornography and or masturbation for a month, then I would suggest that that indicates that you might have a problem. Taking all of this data together, does this prove that pornography and masturbation cannot be engaged in responsibly? I would suggest that no, the data does not support that position. Like many things in life, consuming it to excess may cause problems, but consuming it in moderation won't have any ill effects on you. The problem is, of course, the ever-present slippery slope that beginning with one thing may open you up to other things, and eventually you develop a problem as a result of engaging in the first place. However, this is something which needs to be assessed on an individual case-by-case basis. Personally, I would advise people to simply avoid the whole thing altogether, exercise some self-control and self-discipline, and that self-control and self-discipline will naturally extend to other areas of your life as well. You can always get better, you can always improve, and anything which helps you towards that is only a good thing.